All right, so today we're going deep on democracy and oligarchy.
Two biggies, for sure.
You bet. You cited some really interesting stuff like parts of Wikipedia articles.
Yeah, both democracy and oligarchy.
Right. And something comparing the two right here in the US sounds like a recipe for some heated debate, huh?
Always relevant, that's for sure. Especially these days,
Mhm.
with everyone talking about, like, who really holds the power.
Exactly. And you seem interested in like the global picture, not just the US.
Absolutely. These systems, they play out differently everywhere you go. Different cultures, different times in history. It's fascinating.
Okay, so Wikipedia says democracy is ruled by the many.
Right, rule by the many.
But then it says there's no single, like, agreed upon definition. Makes you wonder, right? How have people thought about democracy over time?
Well, yeah, it's like the people get to rule, but how W? That
Oh, yeah.
happens. That's where things get interesting. Is it just about voting? Or is it more about like how those in power are held accountable? The Wikipedia article even mentions this guy, Karl Popper, a philosopher
Mm-hmm.
back in the 20th century.
Right.
He contrasted this classical democracy with something he called protective democracy.
Protective democracy. Now that's a new one.
Right. So in a protective democracy, it's about like safeguarding individual rights and freedoms,
Yeah.
even from what Popper called the tyranny of the majority.
Yeah.
So it's not just about what the majority wants, but about making sure certain rights like can't be messed with.
So it's not just who rules, but how they rule and
Yeah.
what limits are there on their power.
Exactly. And that brings us to, the different types like direct versus representative democracy. These aren't just ideas.
Yeah.
They really change how things work.
Okay, so direct democracy is when people vote directly on laws, like ancient Athens.
Yeah, ancient Athens, the article says it might be the first known democracy.
Wow. Imagine that. Everyone in your city arguing and deciding stuff together.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Pure popular control, right? But tough to do on a large scale. These days, Switzerland's a good example. They've got referendums and initiatives letting people directly influence policy. But Switzerland's also, pretty small and everyone's pretty similar.
So regular folks in Switzerland really do have a say, huh? What about representative democracy then?
That's what most of us know. We elect people to make decisions for us, like the UK Parliament or the US Congress.
Right. It's like trusting them to do the homework we don't have time for.
Uh-huh, exactly. But the key here is accountability. Are they really representing the people? Big debate there, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Huge debate. It makes you think, right? What are the trade-offs? Direct democracy, maybe more control but slow and messy. Representative democracy, more efficient, but you got to trust those in power.
Yeah, tough choices. And it's not just countries either. You mentioned contemporary integration examples, things like the European Union, NATO. They aren't, countries, but do they use democratic ODS?
That's what I'm wondering. Are they something else entirely?
They're definitely unique, more like collaborations between states, often relying on like cooperation and consensus. But voting and representation are still there. The EU, for example, they have a directly elected parliament and a council with reps from each country's government.
So democracy has evolved a lot, no one size fits all. But are there like common features, things we look for to spot a democracy?
Well, for sure. Freedom of assembly, speech, the right to vote, equality before the law. These are like the hallmarks, usually written into a constitution or legal framework, like those fundamental rights we were talking about.
Yeah, you're right. Those are the core principles. But I also saw something about democratic transitions. What does that mean? How does a country become more or less democratic?
Ah, now that's the heart of it, right? How does a country shift from one way of governing to another? It could be economic development, social movements, pressure from other countries. Sometimes it's gradual, other times it's like, bam, revolution.
Big changes.
Think like the Berlin Wall coming down or the Arab Spring. Those were like rapid transitions, though not always successful in the long run.
So even once you have democracy, it's not guaranteed to stay, right? Is that where democratic backsliding comes in?
Sadly, yes. Democracies can weaken, even collapse. Coups, for example, where someone takes power illegally. Could be through the military or by messing with elections to make it look legal. Democracy's fragile. It needs constant work, kind of like a garden.
Right, you plant the seeds, but you got to keep tending to it, pulling weeds, making sure it gets sun.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article mentioned a study saying peace and stable borders make it more likely a country will become and stay democratic. Makes sense, right? It's tough to being a democracy when you're always at war or in chaos.
Right, you need a solid foundation to build on. This democracy thing, it's complicated. Speaking of threats to democracy, let's switch gears and talk about oligarchy. Wikipedia says it's about power concentrated in a small, privileged group.
Ruled by the few,
Yeah.
often based on wealth, family connections, or something else that makes them, exclusive.
Not exactly the good guys, then.
Not always, no. But it's not always about personal riches or family ties. Sometimes it's control over resources or institutions, like
Corporations, the
yeah,
military, religious groups.
precisely. Those can be the basis for oligarchic power, even places that look kind of democratic on the surface,
Right.
like a fancy facade hiding a rotten core.
That's a bit unsettling. The Wikipedia article on oligarchy gives some real-world examples. Some are pretty surprising.
For sure. Take the Philippines, for example.
Yeah.
They've been dealing with powerful oligarchies, often these family dynasties controlling huge parts of the economy.
Yeah.
These families, they can really influence politics, even who gets elected. President Duterte, he made tackling this a big part of his thing, though how effective he's been is still up for debate.
So a modern-day battle against, like, entrenched power happening right now. What about Russia?
Oh, Russia's a fascinating case. After the Soviet Union fell apart, a new bunch of oligarchs popped up. They got control of all these industries that used to be run by the state.
So they're, like, super rich and influential.
You bet, both inside Russia and globally. Critics say they have way too much influence on political decisions, like a modern-day version of feudalism, where a small elite controls most of the land and resources. Makes you wonder how much real democracy can exist alongside that kind of power.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've got to dig deeper into this, but it seems like this democracy versus oligarchy thing, it's not just history. It's happening right now all over the world.
Absolutely. Understanding this tension can help us make sense of, like, the whole political scene, not just in the U.S., but everywhere.
Feels like we've uncovered this power struggle that's been hiding in plain sight. We always focus on elections and parties, but maybe the real story is about like these deeper forces fighting for control.
Yeah, it's a pretty compelling idea.
Yeah.
And it makes you think about, the role of information in all of this. That democracy article on Wikipedia, it had a whole section on the media.
Right. Like the media is a player in this whole power struggle. It shapes how we see the world and ultimately how we vote.
Exactly. In a perfect world, the media would give people the information they need to, make good decisions. But,
Mm.
and it's a big but, it doesn't always work like that.
Oh, I know it.
There's bias, misinformation, sometimes straight up propaganda. And with the internet and social media, it's gotten even more complicated.
It really has. It's like information overload, right? So many opinions, it's hard to know what to believe. Like that saying, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. But now it's more like the lie goes around the world 1,000 times before truth even finds its shoes.
Exactly. Misinformation spreads so fast and people get stuck in these echo chambers where they only hear stuff that, like, confirms what they already believe.
Yeah.
Makes us more divided, makes it harder to even talk to people who see things differently.
So this isn't just some theoretical threat to democracy. This is happening in debut.
It is.
Is there any way to fight this? Or are we just going to be puppets for algorithms and propaganda?
It's not hopeless, but it takes work. We have to be smarter about how we consume information. We can't just believe everything we see online. Fact check, consider different viewpoints, and be careful about stuff that's trying to manipulate you with, like, strong emotions.
Sounds like we need to be media experts just to survive.
I think you're right. Which brings us back to the U.S. and that whole debate about, whether it's becoming more oligarchic. Remember that podcast clip you sent? They made a pretty strong statement.
They did. And the Wikipedia article on oligarchy also talks about the U.S., saying that even with our democratic structures, we might be showing some oligarchic tendencies. That's a pretty bold claim.
The article talks about how wealth and political influence are concentrated among a small elite, and that this undermines the idea of, like, equal representation and fair competition. But it's a complex issue.
For sure. It's like trying to untangle a huge knot. How do we even measure if a country is really democratic or oligarchic? Is it just about the official government stuff, or are there other things to consider?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's where things get messy because there's no single definition everyone agrees on. Some people look at wealth distribution, others at access to education, others at the influence of special interest groups. There are whole studies dedicated to measuring and comparing levels of democracy around the world.
So are we like overthinking this? Is it really that hard to tell the difference between a democracy and an oligarchy? I feel like we should know it when we see it.
I get what you mean, but think about it this way. A country can have democratic stuff, like elections and a constitution, but still have oligarchic tendencies. The real question is, who really has the power? And are they using it to benefit everyone or just themselves?
So it's not just about ticking boxes on a checklist. It's about the bigger picture, how power works, who benefits, and if there's any way to hold those in power accountable.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it's safe to say that in the U.S., at least, more and more people are worried that the system isn't working for them anymore.
It feels like we're at some kind of turning point. If people lose faith in democracy, something else will take its place, and that might not be good for our freedom and rights.
You're right. That's something to consider. The stakes are high. What happens to democracy in the U.S. and everywhere depends on whether we can face these challenges and find solutions.
We can't be passive. We have to stay engaged and informed. It's like we're all in this together, ready or not. We can't just sit back and hope for the best. We got to actively shape the world we want to live in.
Absolutely. Which brings us to another interesting point, democratic peace theory. That democracy article mentioned that democratic countries are less likely to go to war with each other.
So spreading democracy could make the world a safer place. Sounds a bit too good to be true.
It's definitely a controversial idea, but there's some evidence backing it up. Of course, war is complicated. There are always exceptions. But it's something to think about.
It is. It makes you wonder about the role of, like, NGOs and international groups in promoting democracy. The article calls it democracy promotion.
Right, democracy promotion.
Which could involve financial aid, election monitoring, and sometimes even military intervention. Though that last one's pretty controversial.
For sure.
Yeah.
But the point is, democracy isn't just a local thing. It affects the whole world, and there are lots of players, governments, and non-governments trying to promote it globally. It's a complex web, but it shows how connected we all are.
It seems like, for all its flaws, democracy is still the best system we've got for protecting individual rights and making sure power serves the many, not the few.
I agree. It's worth fighting for, but we can't get complacent. Democracy is always changing, and we got to keep working to make it better, to adapt it to the challenges of, the 21st century.
It's like a giant experiment, and we're all part of it. We've covered a lot here. The history and definition of democracy and oligarchy, the pros and cons of each, challenges of democratic transitions, the role of the media, the debate about the U.S. and global democracy promotion. That's a lot to process. What are some key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about as they explore these topics more?
Good question. I think the biggest takeaway is that these aren't just abstract ideas. They really affect us, all of us. How our societies are governed changes our lives in big ways, from the quality of our education and healthcare to the safety of our streets and even the air we breathe.
It's not just something happening in some far-off government building. It's about our daily lives, the world we live in.
Exactly. So it's important to engage with these ideas, to understand the different systems out there, and to work towards making sure the systems we live under are truly serving the people.
We can't just sit back and watch. We have to be part of it, shaping the world we want. But how? Where do we even start? It feels like we've been given this huge puzzle, and we're only just starting to see how the pieces might fit together.
Right.
But where do we even begin to solve it?
Well, just recognizing that there's a puzzle, that's a big first step. Lots of people, they never even question the systems that, govern their lives.
Yeah.
But you're clearly thinking about these things, and that's great.
It can be a bit overwhelming, though, right? The more we learn, the more complex it all seems.
Yeah, but that's what makes it so interesting. It's a journey. You never stop learning. And remember, this deep dive, it's just a starting point.
Right.
There are tons of books, articles, other podcasts, you name it, that go even deeper into these topics.
So what do we do with all this? Should we be hitting the books, signing petitions, running for office?
There's no one right answer. It's about, finding what speaks to you, what you're passionate about. Maybe you dive into the history of democracy or look at different ways countries are trying to govern themselves. Maybe you become an advocate for campaign finance reform or get involved in local politics to make a difference right where you live.
It's exciting, but also kind of scary, right? We've been given this big responsibility, but no instructions.
That's where critical thinking comes in. You got to question things, look at the evidence, and form your own opinions. Don't just believe what anyone tells you, even us.
Right.
Look at different perspectives, challenge your own biases, be open to changing your mind.
So it's we've been given the keys to the car, but we still got to learn how to drive.
Exactly. And like driving, it takes practice, You got to be patient and okay with making mistakes. The important thing is to keep going, keep learning.
So this whole democracy versus oligarchy thing, it's not just something we watch from the sidelines. We're all part of it, whether we realize it or not.
Right.
And the choices we make, the things we do, they all shape the world we live in.
You got it. And I think that's the biggest lesson from our deep dive today, understanding that you have the power to make a difference.
It's both empowering and a little scary.
Yeah.
Like, okay, I get it, but what NOW? What's my next step?
Well, we'll leave you with one final thought. If democracy is really about rule by the people, how do we make sure the people have the knowledge, the skills, the opportunities they need to actually govern well? That's something to think about and something we all have a role in figuring out.
That's a great point to end on. So that wraps up our deep dive into democracy and oligarchy. Hopefully you found it informative and interesting, maybe even a little inspiring.
I hope so.
Remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you. That's how we make sure democracy, for all its, messiness and complexity, has a bright future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time, happy exploring.